Okay, so I'm going to be reading the Christian centuries, the first 600 years. I'm just going to see how far I can get in the next hour or so. This is for Father Michel's church history class at Antiochian House of Studies. And so, but I'm going to just start out and I'll separate this from the other video so that, or, in post-processing. Just going to go over so that I have it fresh in my mind the hermeneutic that Father Michel hopes to teach us to see history through, as I understood it from the residency program that we did last week. So it seems like in this program, all the professors agree that the perspective we should take toward history should be informed by our experience in the church, our experience of the liturgies, the liturgical rites, the mysteries of the church, which are a form of initiation that change your sight and thus give you a different hermeneutical lens through which to see history, such that you arrange the details of history differently based on your vantage point. And the ultimate vantage point is from the mountaintop, from where God is symbolically. And so you must be participating in the life of the church, in the purification of the nous that takes place when you engage in the spiritual life as a part of the academic process, that there's no separating growth spiritually from intellectual exploration. And if you are separating those things, the one is going to dominate the other, and it's going to cause internal tension and dissociation between the different aspects of who you are, your spiritual life from your intellectual life. And that is not a good situation to be in unless frankly your spiritual life is anemic, or is not actually drawing you nearer to God. And so that there is a sense in which it is inevitable that we feel that way because none of us are saints. But at the same time, that we're supposed to be striving for a form of objectivity that isn't just based on serving the God reason, which exists lower down in the hierarchy of meaning than ultimately the Trinity. But we're meant to be working on our life spiritually so that when we look at history, we're not just arranging facts in a way that mirrors our own darkened nous. Whether our sense of perception, our hermeneutical lens, is darkened by pride or lust or wrath, anger, or sloth, or envy, is going to condition how we arrange the events of history, what we choose to emphasize. If we're envious, we'll emphasize possibly the role of money in shaping history. Not that it's wrong to emphasize or to acknowledge the role that the love of money plays in the shaping of history and the gathering of wealth in concentrated areas and how that manifests itself. But it isn't the ultimate story. History is ultimately told by the victors. And if, as Orthodox Christians, we believe in Christus Victor, ultimately, even if in the present moment, victory hasn't been won yet, the arc of history moves Godward, or rather the arc of history moves toward the second coming of Christ in each of our hearts, and ultimately mysteriously in history, in reality, in action. And so we need to be attempting to arrange the events of church history and history more broadly, and even arrange the events that we see unfolding in the lives of those around us who are Christians or non-Christians in a way that sees the hand of God at work in their lives, and thus the only one who truly is objective, which is God, because God is everywhere present and filling all things. He's the only one who can see all events simultaneously and put them in their proper order in relation to himself, the grounded being. The other options, really, there's not a whole lot in terms of other options for once you understand this way of seeing things, it actually, everything falls into place. Like you can't Like if you, for example, if your mind is darkened by lust, you'll probably take a Freudian reading of history. Just intuitively, you're going to see, just as you're going to read other people in a Freudian manner, interpreting all of their actions according to their sex drive. And thus the scope of what you can see, you might see true things. You'll see the sexual scandals, you'll see various things like that, but you won't be able to arrange the historical narrative in a way that takes into account things that are counterfactual to that narrative, because you can't see it, because we're always limited by our horizons. We're limited by our hermeneutical lens, which, alters the range of our sight. And ultimately, it's only God that can see all and knows all. He's the one who holds the book of life. And so, in order to achieve some form of objectivity, we must enter into the cloud of unknowing, and thus take on, at least in part, God's view of things. But that's supposed to bring with it a sense of humility, since the closer you are to God, the smaller you are, because the larger your range, your horizons are. If the higher you go up the mountain, the larger the world seems and the smaller you seem. And so the closer you get to God, the more knowledge you have, the less you feel you know, because your sight is larger. Whereas if you're stuck in a cave, you can know in detail everything about that cave, but if you take that part for the whole, you're in a really, really bad place. And that's pretty much any hermeneutics that isn't attempting to purify the nous is stuck in its own little cave. It's the allegory of the cave playing out, whether it's feminist hermeneutics or LGBTQ hermeneutics or Freudian hermeneutics or Foucaultian hermeneutics, power dynamics. Like, all of these things limit the sight in ways that, because they're not attached to anything larger than themselves. They're Ouroboruses, they're self-eating loops. And so it's important to, when approaching history and reading it as an Orthodox Christian, to be in regular confession, because otherwise I'm going to read my sins into history, just as I'm going to read my sins on the faces of my neighbors and my friends. And that's just the way we operate. Whatever is in us, we see mirrored in the world. And so the only way to crack that mirror is to assimilate into our own bodies something that is more than just us. And that's what we do in the Eucharist. So once again, communion is important. Participation in the life of the church. Acts of charity are important. Like, if I'm not shaped by the life of the church and opening myself up to the process of illumination, then what I'm going to see in history is not going to be illumined. And thus I might see, well, as I said before, I might see aspects of the truth, but I won't know how to arrange them properly. And thus I will come to erroneous conclusions about where it all is going and what it all means and is for. And ultimately, that kind of fracturing of the picture leads to nihilism. When you have two people arguing, one's a Freudian, who's hermeneutic of suspicion, and the other's Nietzschean, the genealogy of morality. You look at those two narratives with respect to history, and they in many ways are incompatible with one another. And so at the level in which they are attempting to describe events, civilization and its discontents. And so if that partial view that kind of elevates one thing beyond what it's capable, but beyond its proper size, you're bound to see everything in a distorted way. It's like looking at history with a convex or concave mirror. Everything's going to be distorted, and you're going to take that distortion for the reality when it's not. Whereas God is the only one that's able to see history clearly, because he was there, and he is there, and he's all everywhere present and filling all things.